Good evening, and welcome to this online lecture on the pasts and futures of Europe. I'm George Stylianou, and I'm your host for this evening. Our guest speaker is Professor Heike Wieters. She joins us from Argentina. Good evening, or rather good afternoon, Heike.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here today.
Just before we start, 2 words on the format. We will start with a brief introductory speech from Constanze Itzel, our museum's director, and Professor Wieters will then speak for about half an hour, and a question and answer session will follow. So please feel free to leave your questions or comments in the comment section in the chat in our YouTube channel, and we will pick them up during the Q&A. Constanze, the floor is yours.
Thank you, George, and many thanks to all of you who joined us this evening. Special thanks, of course, to Professor Wieters for agreeing to share with us her thoughts and knowledge. Heike Wieters, a junior professor for historical European studies at Berlin's Humboldt University, is an expert in the history of European integration in global context. Her research interests also include the internationalization of institutions, the history of non-state organizations during the 19th and 20th century, and concepts and practice of welfare and humanitarian aid. Dear Professor Wieters, dear participants, perhaps tonight's debate goes into the core of our Envisioning Europe lecture series, because it is, in essence, about the kind of Europe we have had in the past, the one we have today, and the Europe we'd like to see in the future. French poet Paul Valéry once remarked that history can serve to multiply ideas. Our permanent exhibition at the House of European History demonstrates that history is in part the outcome of ideas. Admittedly, several of them have been terribly bad. After all, as we are reminded painfully today by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, European history is also a history of wars. However, our exhibition also displays the wealth of visions for Europe. These need to be examined through the lens of the era in which they were conceived. They vary in such a degree also because they depend on who and where they came from, as we will also hear this evening. In other words, geographical, social, political, and personal elements are factors shaping the visions of Europe at different historical periods. As there is no fixed definition of what Europe is, and no prevailing or dominating view of what it should be, the continent's reality was always shaped by how its inhabitants viewed the continent. For example, ideas of European federations were suggested as early as 1462 by the King of Bohemia, George of Podiebrad, or in 1640 by French statesman Maximilien de Béthune, the Duke of Sully. English writer and religious thinker William Penn spoke of some sort of a European Parliament as early as 1693. A common European currency was suggested numerous times since the mid-19th century, while the idea of a European army was already present in the 17th century. The House of European History's permanent exhibition, due to its focus on 19th and 20th century Europe, displays more recent ideas about Europe. These include, for example, Victor Hugo's vision, who suggested a United States of Europe in front of the Paris Peace Congress in 1849, and that by the Pan-Europa movement that suggested a Pan-European Union. Dear Professor Wieters, dear participants, out of the ashes of the National Socialist idea of Europe-wide dominance, diametrically opposing ideas of Europe emerged. This time it was all about unity, the creation of a supranational authority, a common market, and a common currency, and the establishment of a freedom of movement. In the effort to unite Europe and to prevent further wars, the European Community for Coal and Steel was born, the European Economic Community and Euratom soon followed. Slowly but steadily, and despite serious setbacks over time, European integration marched on. And today we are citizens of a European Union of 27 member states. But today, Europe is again at the crossroads. And therefore, I look forward to listening to Professor Wieters' view on how Europe's pasts can further shape its futures. and I also look forward to the questions and answer session after the lecture. Thank you for being with us tonight, and I wish you all a very fruitful debate.
Thank you so much, Constanze. A quick reminder, excuse me, to our viewers, please leave your questions, comments in our chat section on our YouTube channel. Heike, over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, George, but also Constanze for your very kind introduction. I'm just going to start this lecture by an observation that in many ways I will deal with a matter of course today. Every child learns at some point that there are always many sides to each story, and that in order to really understand something, you may have to change your perspective or your viewpoint from time to time. When we talk about Europe and what we make of it, this kind of everyday observation is an absolute necessity. Europe can indeed be so many things: a geographical space, political entity, a social space, a common market sphere, a space in which certain legal norms and traditions are practiced, a shared, albeit diverse, cultural heritage, or something that defines or frames people's identities and may give orientation or provide stability. Yet, at the same time, Europe is also a highly fractured concept, a somewhat fuzzy pattern that elopes as soon as we really try to pin it down. What's more, Europe can be a very exclusive space, defined by both material and immaterial borders that separate the inside from the outside, the us from the others, the usually very broadly defined Europeans from the rest of the world. These inner and outer borders, divides, and peculiarities have become so much more obvious and visible during the last few weeks of violence and war in Ukraine. And since the start of the war, every major newspaper has commented on these remarkable shifts in European sentiments and identities that the attack on Ukraine has brought on most of us as contemporaries and European citizens. So what I wanted to start this lecture with is a reminder that Europe is not, and probably never will be, an entirely stable and well-defined term or concept. And this is even more true for the term United Europe. What we make of Europe, what we want Europe to be or to become, depends deeply on our standpoint, our past experiences, our lifestyle, our social status, and of course, our political convictions and worldviews. And to complicate matters even more, this also goes for our European past. If we cannot agree on what Europe is today or how a joint European future should look like, why should this be any easier when looking at the past? And this now will be my main topic today. For the next 30 minutes or so, I will deal with the question, what have people before us made of Europe, or rather the idea of a more united Europe? How have contemporaries, but also historians, tried to mold Europe into an object, a scientific object maybe even, an object in any way that merits scrutiny and closer attention? What were people's goals, hopes, and ambitions when describing and imagining Europe's role in history and global affairs? The announcement to this lecture promised a look back on the period from the 18th century to the present. But for the sake of the argument and a better overview, I will very briefly even look back a little bit further. We have, of course, or we do have to be careful with drawing all too long lines when talking about the history of Europe, of course. Modern science-based historiography located at universities that work like the universities we know today is a relatively recent phenomenon and did indeed emerge in the 18th and 19th centuries. But of course, there were historians before this, people that analyze the state and perspective of an ever-changing world, and people whose publications were read by select contemporaries, but of course also by future generations of readers. As such, antique philosophers, just as well as chroniclers and writers in the Middle Ages, already used the term Europe and defined it in various ways, as a geographical space that could be mapped and measured by highlighting shared ideas and traditions, or, and that is probably even more important, they defined Europe as a religious entity, threatened by outsiders and thus ever expanding and fluctuating, and of course also as a dynastic network, interconnected by marriage patterns and of course merchant routes. We have to bear in mind, though, that European borders in, let's say, 1400 were much different from today, especially since the nation state was not yet invented, as Benedict Anderson would argue. Europe was a very diverse and fractured space, characterized by various demarcation lines, but also by many trans-regional connections, as for example, historian Michael Burgolte has argued. Apart from the religious dimension, the idea of a united Europe certainly mattered little to most people, at least in everyday life. But Europe could already be experienced in a way, not by everyone every day, but certainly by those who were mobile because they were part of a political or economic elite, or by those who migrated across great distances in search of labor, food, peace, or better opportunities. Just like Constanze just mentioned in her introduction, historians of the pre-Enlightenment era, such as Pier Francesco Giambullari or later Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau as thinkers of the Enlightenment, already published histories of Europe in which they increasingly reflected on joint European traditions and cultural and ideational similarities on the continent. But it was the secularization of historical thinking that actually changed scientific discourse about Europe and also about a united Europe in decisive ways. Excluding religious salvation stories and eschatology from history led to new and more dynamic debate about periodization and spaces of belonging. In some way, it enabled new ways of systematizing knowledge and historic information that past generations had accrued. And as such, it led to an intensified intellectual struggle about Europe and its place in history. It is against this backdrop that historians like Wolfgang Schmale and others have argued that Europe as a topos, and hence as some kind of pattern of thinking used to conceptualize and interpret Europe as a scientific object, started to emerge in the 18th century. It is no coincidence that the historical sciences really started to take hold at universities across the European continent during this exact time. And one of the central reasons why history, a certain kind of history, started booming was the formation of nation states. As again, Benedict Anderson and others remind us, nation states were in some ways invented and made, even though the way they were constructed was not necessarily contingent. So shared language and traditions, economic and social ties were used and affirmed as markers to argue for the emergence of nations in a world that had previously been divided or maybe also united by other demarcations, and the main ones being, of course, dynastic or religious. Modern statecraft, the emergence of high-impact bureaucracies and state-run welfare institutions, helped to transform the ideas that had first been put forward by national movements and put them into actual effect and into something that soon seemed natural and as if it had always been there. And historians played a crucial part in this process. They helped shape the foundational stories of these nation states and collected or highlighted traditions. Some colleagues would say they partly also invented these traditions that made it into the repertoire of national historiography. Interestingly enough, Europe did play an important part in these interpretations. European comparisons between national states or some of their features became very much en vogue, as did historical studies that went beyond these comparisons and asked for joint European intellectual or cultural traditions. Today, we find quite some controversy about both the somewhat politicized role of national historiography in the 18th and 19th century and the impact of inherently Eurocentric approaches that we used and that tended to convey a story of vested European superiority and that partly even helped to justify European colonial expansionism. While this is certainly true, it is, however, also a little bit easy from our perspective today to criticize these contemporaries. We should, of course, criticize those mindsets that prevail and that exist up until today. But I believe that it's also very important to historicize these ideas and understand them in their historical context. Because investigating the past and doing it in a scientific way obliges us to reflect on the mindsets of the actors we study, on what they knew and what they maybe didn't, and also on what the actors and including historians of that era needed and used the past for. Just as much, by the way, as it obliges us to be aware of our own temporal and spatial standpoints and perspectives today. And this mindset, the mindset I just described, is particularly important when looking at 20th century European historiography, and even more so when dealing with those actors that promoted the somehow inherently utopian idea of a united Europe. This idea, or maybe you could rather say concept or claim, these concepts did not emerge out of the blue. My colleague Florian Greiner, in his book Roads to Europe, has argued quite convincingly that during the first half of the 20th century, a whole array of conflicting ideas and concepts of a united Europe started to emerge. Liberals, conservatives, nationalists, socialists, labor movement, Catholic circles, transnational political networks of parties, and so on and so forth, they all harbored and promoted ideas of a more united Europe. They drew utopian maps and invented political institutions for the future. They cooperated and argued with other groups, and they drafted political programs or formed clandestine or even public international organizations and networks to help foster future European unity. It is important to stress that many of these concepts did not at all work as countermodels to the nationalist worldviews of the epoch. This is painfully apparent in the plans for a national socialist Europe under German leadership that historian Vanessa Conze and others have been doing research on. But there are many other examples that show how nationalism or the nation state and ideas of a united Europe were very often interlaced. This is, by the way, an observation that Alan Milward has picked up on a more methodological level in his book on European integration after the Second World War, which he interpreted as the rescue of the nation state. But I will come back to this again in a few minutes. For now, I would like to stick with the perks of historically investigating ideas regarding Europe's united future during the first half of the 20th century. What I would like to stress here is that if we as historians investigate the history of Europe, it is not enough to only focus on the development and emergence of different ideas and concepts regarding a united Europe. Instead, we also have to focus Instead, we also have to focus on the many very real European experiences people made. Hence, we also have to talk about material things, about shared spaces and common practices, but also, of course, about dividing lines, exclusion, and violence. Researchers investigating Europe and Europeanization processes are thus often differentiating between something they call Europe imagined So a Europe conceptualized by ideas and demands, and some kind of everyday Europe, or Europe experienced, constituted by everyday practices such as mobility, joint markets, political relations, and so on. Looking at the first half of the 20th century, we see many societal developments that were similar or often even deeply entangled within Europe. The rise of welfare institutions in most of Europe, unprecedented technological progress and standardization processes, rapid and interlacing developments in transport and communication infrastructure, as well as new and particular forms of social mobility and educational opportunities in many parts of Europe. At the same time, we see the rise of competing ideologies. We see Nazism and surging anti-Semitism leading to the Shoah. We see 2 world wars that led to exile and mass migration, food shortages, and to unprecedented violence in and beyond Europe. And especially the latter part of this enumeration may convey the impression that the first part of the 20th century was an absolutely rotten ground for anything European, let alone a united Europe. And indeed, after having been expatriated in 1933 from Nazi Germany, Kurt Tucholsky, a well-known German author and intellectual, wrote, "In Europe, you are a compatriot in only one of 23 cases. Wise people are foreigners 23 times." This quotation certainly reflects Tucholsky's way of dealing with his personal fate of being exiled, and of course also with his political opposition to fascism. But it also reminds us of the fact that war, expulsion, and exile have left a heavy mark on the dimension of experiencing Europe for millions of people on the continent and beyond. While these experiences could have been the end of any ideas or hopes concerning a united Europe, they were not. To the contrary. It was precisely against the backdrop of violence, unrest, instability, and war that the utopian potential of the claim for a united Europe became particularly attractive. And this is a somewhat current observation at the moment, if I may say so. This feeling that a future united Europe was needed was true not only for the countless groups and networks that set their eyes on building the many joint European institutions after the end of the Second World War, but to some extent also to the historians that retrospectively investigated this process. It's probably not entirely circumstantial that some of the early historians of European integration in the second half of the 20th century had a rather positivist and maybe also teleological perspective on the multitude of processes they witnessed. And they somehow felt that it was at least partly their job to supply the new Europe with a historical foundation and with a solid basis from which new and more peaceful versions of a European identity beyond the national ones could grow. From these reflections on past ideas and experiences of a united Europe, I would like to kind of fast forward to our current situation. Looking at Europe today, at the European Union, at the very, very tight network of international organizations, and at the countless inner European civil society networks that exist, we can certainly conclude that the current state of Europe is very different from most of the visions that the contemporaries in the 1930s and 40s may have imagined. We can very happily report that National Socialist plans for a racialized European empire under Nazi leadership were foiled. And neither religious plans for Occidental Europe nor socialist plans for a Europe of laborers or European plans developed by federalist movements came to play exactly as they had been imagined or proposed, even though, of course, we still find remaining bits and pieces of these ideas and concepts whenever we look more closely. Europe is and will probably always be work in progress. And of course, to some extent, it is very important to look back and to understand traditions and past ideas in their historical context, I may add, to get a more nuanced understanding of the run-up to the present day, the difficulties along the way, and the challenges that are most probably yet to come. When I talked about past and current ideas and hopes related to a united Europe at another occasion a few years back in 2019, I underscored that we should definitely be very happy that at least one of the goals that most of the contemporaries in the 1930s and 40s had rooted for when they talked about a more united Europe, that one of the goals, meaning the end of inner European war, had apparently been achieved. And back in 2019, I said that I was quite confident that despite all apparent tensions and obvious problems, and we have to talk about the problems like, for example, the effects of the European immigration regime, the severe economic and social effects of austerity policies in many parts of the Union, the rise of populist and right-wing parties in many parts of Europe, just to name a few. So despite all these problems, and there are more, I was confident in 2019 that peace within Europe would last. I truly believe that European entanglements, economic, social, cultural, and also structural and institutional, were a solid basis to make war in Europe a thing of the past. Now in 2022, this prediction feels more than a tad out of place. And I confess that I still have trouble believing that peace should be this fragile and that global political institutions could be stunned so easily when confronted with political leadership that is ready to defy all agreed upon rules. This realization should not keep us from imagining a better European future, though. On the contrary, I believe that this is still urgent and a very timely thing to do. I do not want to be misunderstood, though. We cannot take historical examples or ideas and just project them on the future. It is important to look back and try to understand what kind of visions of a united Europe were imagined then by the different actors, and also to what end. And I am convinced that understanding the various hopes and plans for the future of Europe in the past may help us to understand, and somehow maybe also to appreciate the fact that the situation is very similar today, since there are still very many different versions and visions of a united Europe, despite the fact that many things have changed since then, institutionally, politically, and also with regard to the integration of the societies in Europe. The fact that there are still various and partly also conflicting ideas of a united Europe is proof of how far we've come, but also proof of the size of the task ahead. And I would also like to stress that some ideas, like, for example, the ideas of a united Europe, are worth every bit of quarrel and debate that we actually see. Personally, I like to argue about different visions of a united Europe, since I certainly hope for a more diverse, more democratic, and more transparent Europe, and for reforms that foster social and economic integration for the people in Europe, but also beyond. I really hope that European civil society will grow in strength and interconnectedness, and eventually be able to transform political institutions such as the European Union into even better versions of themselves. More democratic, less bureaucratic maybe, better equipped to deal with the social question in the 21st century. But coming back to what I said before, we have to bear in mind that Europe, let alone united Europe, will never be realized through ideas or programmatic concepts alone. Europe will always also be made wherever and whenever people live and work in European settings, communicate across language barriers, study, learn, and practice everyday European life. And I would like to relate what I've just said to an area that I, as a historian, feel most comfortable and competent talking about, and that is academia. By now, an ever-growing number of our students take part in the Erasmus program. They practice European mobility to live, study, and sometimes also love abroad during a phase that is highly important for everyone's personal development. And they come back knowing not only much more about the country they have stayed at, but also filled with new impressions about their home country and views that they could only develop because they changed their perspective or viewpoint for a while, just like I said in my opening paragraph. Both temporary and permanent migration processes in and beyond Europe have tremendously diversified the student body, and just as well as our academic staff. We all speak various languages by now. We have traveled the continent, know Budapest by night and London by day. And even more importantly, we know that life chances in Europe and the rest of the world are still far from equal. And as such, we also know how fragile the European project as we know it is. There is no automatism and no finality in history. European integration is not something that simply continues and deepens ad infinitum towards an ever closer union. And not every step towards closer integration is necessarily good or desirable per se. But I'm still convinced that people who live European and learn to appreciate certain chances and forms of freedom, like, for example, freedom of movement, that these people will be more inclined to enter into a debate about the future of Europe and a debate about what they perceive of as good and desirable future. And these people that have tasted these kind of freedoms will certainly appreciate this debate more than people who've never left their backyard. And this, by the way, is all the more reason to extend programs such as Erasmus to wider parts of our European societies, not only to students. Let me close this lecture by citing my colleague Florian Greiner again, who in his book Road to Europe underscores that Europe has always been both a place of countless crises and a moment of hope. As I said at the beginning, Europe is a very, very fuzzy concept. And this is probably all the more apparent at this very moment in history. But I have the feeling that this fuzziness should probably not disturb us too much, as it also gives us the chance to be many things at the same time. European, German, French, or Ukrainian, social democrat or conservative, woman, cat lover, ardent lover of 19th century poetry, jazz enthusiast, you name it. It is probably one of the better human characteristics to constantly search for individual and collective identity, while also being able and willing to permanently deconstruct and rebuild it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Wieters, for this interesting lecture. I've been checking out our chat, and unfortunately, we don't seem to have any questions. Our viewers seem to be a little bit shy today. So I once again would like to encourage people who are following us, if you have any questions for Heike, please feel free to introduce them in the chat so that we can pose them directly so that we can have a dialogue. But I'll make the start then, and I'll go from where you concluded, Heike. You mentioned that there is a fuzziness about what united Europe is, and it should probably not disturb us. My question is, shouldn't it disturb us though? Because yes, it gives us a chance, again, as you said, to have a diverse and multi-layered identity, different things coming out. You mentioned social democrat, conservative, woman, cat lover, all those things that make us who we are. But at the same time also, it perhaps makes peace more fragile, which is, again, something you referred to earlier in your lecture. So surely would be better off with a less fuzzy, let's say, and better defined framework within which we can develop, or we can let these complex identities of ours foster and grow?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, of course, this is a very, very good question and a very interesting remark. I have the feeling that there's really no way of changing this essential fuzziness of the concept of Europe. But I agree that in different areas of what we mean when we talk of Europe, we should definitely try to find better definitions, or agree at least about what we are talking at the moment. So I think we should not, for example, not confuse the European Union with the European project. And when we talk about the European Union, we should talk about the European Union of certain parts or institutions that are part of this.
How would you separate the European Union from the European project?
I think it's a part, but as I said, I also believe that Europe is the countless international organizations that have been there even before the European Union, and it's European civil society. So I think there's many layers that make Europe, that make what we see as European project today. And the European Union is a big one and an important one, but it's definitely not the only one.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we should really define what we are talking about and see that Europe is very multi-layered, and that there's very many institutions and structures that make Europe, and that this is not only the European Union, even though it's an important part, but it's also other things like European civil society, for example.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned about the necessity to give the civil society a stronger role in this.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, please go ahead. Why would you think that it is essential to have a stronger civil society?
Because I actually think that what I just said, that experiencing Europe is done on this level. So what we do, that we travel from one place to the next, that we get to know people, that we develop political interest, or be it in the history of Europe or be it in something entirely different. All this is done on a civil society level. And when I as an academic, I do research with my European colleagues, this may be in the framework of, I don't know, Erasmus program or something else, but it is also on a personal level, because we develop common interest and have similar questions. And I think that this level is even more important, or at least as important as political agreements and institutions.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned that Europe is not, and probably will never be, a well-defined term or concept, which ties in with what you've been saying now about the various layers. And obviously, you ascribe a positive side to this. Is it really helpful, though, to ask the inhabitants of Europe, of the continent, that we will never have a well-defined term? And why would you say that is?
Well, I mean, I don't possess any foresight. So, I mean, maybe at some point we're going to have this kind of well-defined and very obvious concept. And I mean,
should we try? Should we try to have a well-defined concept, or no?
I don't think it's possible, because we are we are diverse. We are constantly shaping and reshaping our identities, just like I said. And I'm not sure that by actually closing in on the concept and making it too narrow, that we don't do more harm than good. So again, like I said, I think if we agree on a certain project and on changing something or making something better, it's very good that we actually define what we are talking about. But I don't think that the overall concept of Europe and what belongs to Europe and what doesn't will ever be defined, finally defined. I can't see it. And I don't see the need for this.
Just a word of encouragement for us now. We just had a comment from Romania, from Gabriela. She's thanking us for a very interesting presentation. She's saying that we are having a very interesting presentation tonight. So if we also have questions, that would be ideal. So I want to go into another subject that runs throughout your presentation, that idea of a nation state as opposed to a united Europe. You know, we tend to regard, as you said, the idea of a united Europe somehow as inherently utopian, as you said, right? And my question is, why do we do that? But when it comes to the nation state, which again, as you correctly pointed out, it is an invention, why do we view the nation state as something normal or even natural? And the concept of a united Europe seems so utopian. Why is that?
Mm-hmm. This is an excellent question. It's really very good one. I mean, I'm sure that we are going to see processes of naturalization, so to speak. So I hope, and I can see that maybe in a couple of decades, Europe will seem, or many of the European institutions that we have now will seem much more natural and apparent than they may seem at the moment. But at the same time, I mean, the United Europe, or the Europe that we see at the moment, when we talk about the European Union, for example, does lack a few features that made the nation state so very attractive. One central feature that I always like to talk about is the welfare system. Nation states really managed to build connections between their citizens and their state bureaucracies by providing for them, by taking care of old age security, for all health insurance, all that. And the European Union, for example, has come a long way. So we have the European insurance card, and that is really a very big achievement. I can see that. But the
You mentioned also Erasmus, which is, again, yeah.
It's a great achievement. And we don't have to sell this short. So this is really, there are many things that are not, that many people don't see in their everyday life, but that are still there. But still, I think up until today, many of the important features that connect citizens and, for example, nation states are still on the level of nation states. That is one most important thing, I think, is really the welfare bureaucracy.
I'll hold on to
for Europe for the European Union, for example, to work differently and to somehow develop into something that is more important and that really shapes everyday life of its citizens. I think institutions like this would really be necessary, fundamental.
I'll hold on to the idea of the nation state. I'll come back to the nation state. Heike, it seems that I've lost you a little bit.
There was one break, but I can see and hear you now again.
Okay, good. Well, there was a little bit of a gap. But anyway, I will come back to this idea of the nation state. We've had a couple of questions from some of our viewers. Matrina is asking us what would be the best case scenario for Europe in your view? What would you like to see for Europe?
It's also a very good question. I mean, I think this is something we really have to talk about together and really agree on best steps. I mean, what I just said is probably something that many people wish for. I wish for stronger democratic institutions, for more representation of European citizens, because this is, next to the nation state, another difficulty that we face at the moment, that democratic institutions within the European Union are still rather weak. They have grown stronger a lot in recent decades, but they more could be done. So I think on the level of democratic representation of European citizens, more should be done. I also think that it is absolutely necessary to modernize the migration regime. I think what we're seeing at European borders at the moment is an absolute shame. And I say this as a moment where we see a huge wave of European solidarity. I don't want to dismiss this. I think there's a lot is being done, but especially when it comes to our southern borders, things have to change.
Well, and this is actually the last sad chapter of the refugee book that has been opened for the last decade or so, at least. So we have a second question, as I mentioned before. So let's deal with that one too. What are your thoughts from Lucia? What are your thoughts on adding new member states to the European Union? And what benefits and risks does this pose? And thank you in advance for the response.
Yeah, this is of course also a very timely question. I mean, we've just had this debate about maybe adding Ukraine as a new member state to the European Union in recent weeks. Well, I mean, I'm not a political scientist, and I can only speak as a contemporary and as I'm here.
Historian, yeah.
So what I'm going to say now is less an historical analysis and more my view as a contemporary. I think that we can, or that new member states should be added, but I think that we should still agree on certain rules, and that is transparency, democracy, rule of law, and shared practices in this field, and that we should, and that also when we look at the economic crises in recent years, that judging the economic and social state of new members and trying to find out whether this will really match and allow everyone to get stronger is highly important. Also for the stability of a joint currency and everything. So I think in the long run, it's good to expand the union, but it has to be done after a thorough assessment of joint compatibility. This is what I would like to say.
Thank you, Heike. And also thank you for our viewers. The questions seem to be coming in now. So there is another one from Michael Flumian. He's pointing out that immigration is not solved at the European level. And how can Europe be a whole if a basic issue as this is confined to each member? So our viewer essentially is pointing out that we don't have a common migration policy yet that could deal with the kind of crisis that we have been facing over the past years.
My answer to this is very clear. We have to have a joint migration policy in that regard, and we cannot leave this issue to the countries in the periphery that actually then deal with it in very poor ways. So there has to be a joint strategy, and what we see at the moment is not enough. It's not worthy of a European project. Let's put it like this.
And again, just this point also stresses something else you said before about civil society, where some governments, in the eyes of some people, failed their citizens during this this migration crisis. We had the people of these member states that were on the periphery, as you said, that actually provided a lot for the people who were coming in with nothing, fleeing war, etc. So again, the point you made before about civil society, our societies playing a very active role in what Europe is also definitely an element.
Yes, and I totally agree. And I think we have seen that some of the issues that should have been regulated by states and maybe, as I said, by European institutions were actually taken on by civil society. So there were so many groups and so much solidarity within Europe, and everyone was kind of overwhelmed. And I think some of the tasks at hand should have been handled completely differently. And but of course, it is one of the reasons why I say that we should not sell civil society short. It's one of the biggest resources we have in Europe. I'm relatively certain.
We also have a follow-up from Matrina. The concept of the EU, she says, is amazing in here. Again, I think I'm losing you, or no, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah. We have another question. For a moment there, I thought I lost sound. That the concept of the EU is amazing. That the benefits are great, but so many people look at it negatively. Why do you think that some of our citizens are against the European Union?
Well, I mean, I've mentioned a few things or a few challenges and problems that we are actually facing and for which the European Union is at least partly responsible. I mean, we've talked about the migration crises. We've talked about, let's say, Brexit is another buzzword that often comes up. The next one would be austerity policies after the financial crisis and the way this financial crisis was handled within the European member states. So there was not too much solidarity, and austerity policies were pushed on especially the southern European partners, and this caused really a lot of disruption. And so from a certain perspective, I do understand that, and I certainly feel that it's our job to criticize EU policies on certain levels. That does not mean, for me, that does not mean to reject the European Union altogether, but we have to strive to make it better.
It's our democratic right, yeah. We have to strive to improve it. So
exactly.
For now, I don't think we have another question. So it gives me the opportunity to go back a little bit to the issue of the nation state, which I find fascinating, the fact that it manages to survive for so long. And you, again, you said clearly that it is because it has provided to its citizens, whereas the EU, generally speaking, hasn't managed to do what the nation state has done. But is it only that? Is it the only reason that the historically speaking, that the nation state has proven so resilient? Or is it also the fact that it plays with, it touches on sensitive chords of its audience, of its citizens, like, nationality, religion, stuff which is not so tangible as, let's say, welfare policy?
I think this is certainly also a reason. But as I said, things may change. And I mean, we see a lot of changes in the religious conviction of European citizens. We see a lot of changes in lifestyle, in sense of family, in the way people live their lives and lead, think about family, for example. So things change. And I mean, there's some evidence that European societies are converging on some important levels. But still, I mean, we have language barriers. We have very many differences, not only in regarding language and religion, but also about, like I said, the level of, well, the social reality of everyone. And to kind of combine all this into one big venture is something that will at least take time.
At least. We have about 6 minutes left. So I think I have time to ask one more question. Again, I'll go back to something you said, Europe imagined versus Europe experienced. There is a gap there, you said. Why is it so big? Why is the distance between the two so great?
Well, I think what I said was that somehow the idea of a united Europe has some inherently utopian aspects. to it. And when we think about it, we somehow think about making the future better or more unified, more tangible in very many ways. And I mean, we can also measure this against the things that we see at the moment. So everyday reality, and this is what we experience. I mean, and if we now look back in the past, we see that things have changed tremendously. I mentioned the Erasmus program. I mentioned the fact that we are now 27 member states in the EU and all can take part in freedom of movement. We have the joint European health insurance card. So many things have happened, and there is a lot of developments on many levels. But this idea or these ideas of a united Europe will probably always have this utopian potential, and they will offer like a sneak peek into the future. And so I think it's just natural that the now and this utopian future kind of fall apart. So it would be weird if they converged completely. That's my
Good.
perspective.
Excellent. That's why I asked. I wanted to hear what you thought about it. So we're almost at the end. So is there anything else you would like to share before we go? Like any concluding thoughts, maybe?
No, I think I would just to stress again. Would just like to stress again that in a way it's really a privilege that we can argue about the future of Europe, and that actually building this future of Europe, however it may be in the end or turn out to be in the end, that this is something we should not dismiss lightly. So it's good if we agree, no matter, no problem, but working and fighting towards finding a better version of Europe is something that we should actually engage in.
Professor Wieters, dear Heike, thank you very much for being with us tonight. I'd also like to thank our people, the museum people who worked behind the scenes and made this possible. Fengen, William, Nicola, thank you. And finally, obviously, a big thanks to all those who joined us tonight and participated in the debate and asked their questions. Please don't forget to follow the House of European History, as we have all sorts of different events online and on-site all the time. Thanks a lot.